welcome to another episode of the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, your boy on social media at MMALOTN, and the architect behind the MMA Fight Archive, where we just surpassed 4,000 fighter profiles for you to utilize and ensure you leave no stone unturned when you're researching these upcoming MMA events. With us covering over 17 different promotions from all over the world, you know that the MMA Fight Archive is your one-stop shop to get all your studying in, especially with the Contender series kicking off in a few weeks. I guarantee the Fight Archive will be very useful for you, whether you're looking to predict fights, analyze fights, if you're a coach, if you're a fighter, if you're a commentator, wink, wink, you're able to utilize this service and ensure that you can get as much studying in as possible so you know everything you need to know about these fighters before they step foot in the cage. Let me just give you a quick rundown of what August holds in terms of events that are actually already posted on the Fight Archive. We have LFA 189, Fury FC 95, PFL playoffs, UFC Abu Dhabi, Brave CF 84, Invicta FC 56. We got a UFC Fight Night. We got Contender Series Week 1 on August 13th, ACA 178, LFA 190, CFFC 134, PFL 8, UFC 305, Brave CF 85, Dana White Contender Series Week 2 on August 20th, LFA 191, PFL 9, Road to UFC, I believe it's the semifinal is going down August 23rd, Brave CF 86, KSW 97, we have a UFC Fight Night on August 24th as well, and then to close out the month, Dana White Contender Series Week 3 going down August 27th. All of those events posted on the MMA Fight Archive. Check it out for free with a 7-day free trial. Link for that in the description below. See what all the hoopla is about. I guarantee you'll enjoy it. If you enjoy studying fights, it will save you a boatload of time. All right. This weekend, we're going to be talking about UFC Abu Dhabi, which goes down actually noon Eastern, I believe, is when the prelim starts. So thank God we got a nice and early card this weekend. Headlined by a bantamweight matchup between Corey Sandhagen and Umar Nurmagomedov. Both these guys were originally scheduled to throw down in August, but unfortunately, we had Nurmagomedov pull out. Then we had Sandhagen take on Font, where he suffered an injury. I believe it was a tricep injury. They tried making the fight for March. Sandhagen was not going to be available, so Nurmagomedov took on a short notice UFC newcomer who was undefeated. Name is escaping me at this moment right now. Almakhan Bekzad, I believe. Bekzad Almakhan? Something like that. Either way, Nurmagomedov goes out there, does his damn thing, and now we finally get this main event that we've been looking forward to for over a year now. Obviously, Corey Sandhagen, former title challenger, and then Nurmagomedov saying that a lot of people in the rankings are ducking him, but Sandhagen ducks nobody. So I look forward to seeing how this matchup ends up playing out. We were supposed to get Nick Diaz and Vicente Luque in the co-main event, but unfortunately, travel restrictions for Nick Diaz has kept him out of this matchup, and the UFC decided to lean on Shara Magomedov to make a quick turn and take on Michal Oleksiejczuk in a fight that will surely produce fireworks. There's some other fun fights sprinkled out throughout the card. Very much looking forward to breaking it down for you guys and hopefully having a better prediction night than I had this past weekend at UFC 304. Did not go the way that I wanted it to. Was very heavy on Preston Parsons that night as my lock of the night play. He falls short against Oban Elliott, pretty much getting swept on the scorecards. I underestimated Elliott's cardio and his ability to deal with the pressure from Parsons, and all of his takedown stoppages, his takedown defense held up very well, kept Parsons in the striking realm, and then from there he proved to be the superior striker as well. All credit to Oban Elliott. I gotta stop fading this guy, gotta stop overlooking him. And maybe I have to rethink about how good Preston Parsons actually is. So we fall short on our Lock of the Night play this past weekend, which now drops our Lock of the Night play record to 55-27 for a 67% hit rate. And in terms of the Dog of the Night play, we had Manel Kape, and I thought we were looking good in the beginning. You know, it was a very tepid-paced first round, but I thought we saw Kape land some good strikes. I believe at least two of the judges actually gave that round to Mohaev, which ended up kind of being a head-scratcher for me. And then we saw Kape actually injure his foot or something in the second round, and that clearly compromised him in that round. But yeah, he still goes on and ends up losing that decision there, especially that third round. It seemed like Mokaev did a great job in terms of keeping him on his back there. So we rip up the ticket there. I'm trying to, I had predicted Jake Hadley, but never ended up getting to the betting window there. So very upset with that, especially with how clean he made his performance look against Loughran. But yeah, that now with the cap loss, that drops our dog of the night record to 26-56 for a 32% hit rate in 2024. Yuck. Let's try to fix that and try to get better moving forward. All right, just a quick plug for Godzilla Wins. I drop written breakdowns on their website. Thursdays, we drop the main event breakdown, which if you checked it out this past weekend, you were able to cash on Bilal Muhammad at plus 5.5 point spread. He wins outright, but I was very happy to get that plus 5.5 at minus 105. So make sure you guys check that out. I went 0-3 on my 3 best money line spots. Again, not the greatest prediction card for me last week, but the top 3 money line bets. That drops on Friday, so make sure you guys check that out as well. And just another quick plug for the MMALOTN Patreon page, where I drop written breakdowns for all the fights that I cover. This weekend, I'll be covering LFA 189 strictly on the Patreon page, and also I'll be dropping PFL 7 breakdowns for you guys. And I'm pretty ahead in terms of my studying for this week, so I'll likely drop the PFL breakdowns for you guys either on Tuesday or Wednesday, and I believe that card goes down on Saturday, so nice and early for the PFL breakdowns. I'll have it in written form first on the Patreon page, so if you want to check that out, check the link in the description below. Otherwise, just wait for the YouTube video to come out to the public, again, either Tuesday or Wednesday of fight week. Stay tuned for that. A little bit busy of a week, but we'll stay ahead of the curve here with the studying and staying on top of things. All right. That's a wrap on the intro and all those good things. Let's get right into the breakdowns here. I believe we have 13 fights scheduled for this UFC Abu Dhabi card. Reminder, 12 p.m. Eastern time, prelim start time. So right at noon on the East Coast, 9 a.m. Pacific. Nice and early for the fights. I always love when they kick off these cards nice and early. So we have the rest of the Saturday to be a regular human being, because we dedicate 40 plus weekends of the year to these UFC fight cards on Saturday night when everybody else tries to be a regular human being. So thank you, UFC, for making this earlier, just as you should have been this past weekend. But that's just a conversation for another time. All right, let's get right into it. First fight of the night, Cedric Dumas coming in at minus 220, going up against Denis Tiuliulin, who comes in at plus 185. Dumas and Tiuliulin actually were scheduled to fight a couple months ago. I believe there was visa issues. Sorry, not a couple months ago. This was actually supposed to happen in June at the Saudi Arabia card, if I'm not mistaken. Dumas had some visa issues. He's got it sorted out, and he's still going to be able to fly out to Abu Dhabi and take part in the event this weekend. This is a guy that has a decent kicking game from range, but it seems he often looks to take his opponents to the ground and try to grind them out from that top position. He has a nasty front choke game as well, just as we saw on his contract-winning performance on the Contender Series over Matej Peñas. But I still have a lot of question marks about Dumas' potential and how good he could actually be. The last time we saw him in action back in March against Nursultan Ruzibov, that was a night where we saw him deal with a couple of fouls, and ultimately it was the eye poke that was not seen by the referee that led to the finish, with Ruzibov not letting him off the hook, going out there and eventually getting the finish. So good work from Ruzibov there in terms of taking advantage of that opportunity. But Dumas, again, a lot of question marks about him still, and I'm kind of surprised he's such a big favorite in this spot. He's going up against a Russian striker in Denis Tiuliulin, who has had time at Extreme Couture in the past, but it seems most recently he's been setting up shop back home in Russia, most recently seen with guys like Renat Fakhretdinov, who will surely be helping him with his defensive grappling game, which has been kind of the issue that he's dealt with. You know, with guys like Gregory Rodriguez looking to take him to the ground and grind him out, he really needs to try to keep fights in the upright position where he can showcase his striking, just as we saw him do against Jamie Pickett in his lone UFC victory to date. This is a decent striker, just needs to work on the defense grappling so he can keep fights upright and start battering his opponents. Now, this is a fight where I have question marks about both guys, but I think if Tiuliulin has improved his takedown defense well enough, he will be the better striker in this fight. And at plus 185, it's hard to overlook him as an underdog that could come through in the first fight of the night. Dumas, I don't get the hype on him. I don't really understand what he's that great at. Again, good choke game, decent top control, but I'm not fully sold on his wrestling. The guys that he's been defeating are guys that are pretty much giving him these W's. Abu Azaitar, Cody Brown jumping guillotine, very bad situations there where Tiuliulin, I think we'll see some good enough resistance from him here to try to keep this fight upright, utilizing his striking advantage and possibly even lining up a knockout opportunity for himself. So I'll kick off this card with an underdog here at Tiuliulin, plus 185, beautiful line. Let's see if he can go out there and get the job done. Speaking of strikers, we have a striker's delight here between Yahya Herbert coming in at minus 160, going up against Rolando Bedoya, who comes in at plus 140. Now, it's been a little bit of a rough time for Yahya Herbert since entering the UFC in 2020. He's put together a 2-4-1 record, although that one draw, that was a very unfortunate spot for him where it looked like he was getting the better of Ludwig Klein, but he landed a shot to the midsection area that Klein pretty much played up a little bit, in my opinion, and that eventually caused the referee to take a point from Herbert, and that fight ends up going to a draw. But that's a good thing for Herbert in terms of showing that he can take some big shots. He ate some clean shots against Klein. He's eaten some clean shots in recent fights as well, because that's been the big knock on him, is his durability. In his 4 UFC losses, he's been knocked out 3 times, but that's the unfortunate part, considering that he is a striker. He is a guy that likes to utilize his range, his volume, and his activity to really butcher opponents on the feet. In recent fights, we're seeing him mix up the clinch a little bit more so that he can eat some time off the clock while getting off some knees and some dirty boxing in the clinch. But when he's really in his proper flow state, the best place for him is at range, utilizing his 1-2s down the middle, the up kick up the middle as well, his leg kicks from distance. He's nasty in those ranges. I believe we've seen good enough takedown defense improvements from him, especially training at Team Renegade. We've seen takedown improvements from Leon Edwards in the past. Didn't really show off last week against Bilal Muhammad, but that those defensive grappling is what those guys work on a lot, because a lot of those guys are strikers looking to take their opponent's heads off. Herbert, not a perennial finisher by any means, but very dangerous in the striking realm, especially when he can establish his range and dictate the pace of the fights as well. His opponent, Rolando Bedoya, is 0-2 in the UFC right now, but won a lot of UFC fans over in his short notice UFC debut against Chaos Williams. That was a war, back and forth fight, but ultimately Williams comes out on top, and then Bedoya followed that up by getting outstruck and outworked by Kenan Song. That was a matchup where I had a ton of confidence in Bedoya, thinking that he can really shut down the range and the striking of Song by crashing the pocket repeatedly, landing his big strikes, and maybe even knocking out Song. Unfortunately, after a solid first round, the second and third rounds went Song's way, as he was able to really get Bedoya to walk into his jabs, walk into those stiff shots down the pipe, and that ended up being the difference maker here, as Bedoya, with his unorthodox striking approach, he throws 1-2s, but it seems like he almost like he hammer punches his 2 down the pipe, or not even down the pipe, but just literally downwards, which is very weird and doesn't really generate a whole lot of pressure. He has some decent kicks, but it's really his ability to wage a war that has made him successful, specifically on the regional scene. But another aspect of his fight this weekend that's going to be intriguing to think about is the fact that he's coming down to 155 pounds. You see his physique in the Williams fight, you see his physique in the Song fight, and you can say, hey, this guy could probably fight at 155 pounds, and that's what he used to fight on the regional scene up until about 2018. Then he decided to go up to welterweight, not bother cutting the weight. He had some success there, and then ultimately once he realized being at the UFC level, that's not going to cut it, now we're probably going to see him come in better shape this weekend. But I still think that Yahya Herbert is the better technical striker here. I don't think that Herbert will put Bedoya out. It's clear Bedoya has an insane chin and an insane durability, and this will likely end up being a striking battle for the most part. And I think we'll see Herbert try to initiate the clinch and try to keep Bedoya from landing some of his big power strikes. But I think that we'll see Herbert dictate the pace in this matchup, or at least dictate the range. Utilized a lot of footwork, utilize his jab, his speed advantage that he should have here as well, and really keep Bedoya at bay. Minus 160 makes me a tad bit queasy, but considering the technical striking advantage that he should have here, that minus 160 might end up looking like a steal. What I'll be honing in on is likely the decision prop on Herbert at plus 150, which is what BetOnline currently has. I'll probably wait until later in this week and see what FanDuel or BetMGM or DraftKings end up dropping the prop at, but I'll likely be honing in on that decision prop. I don't see Herbert knocking out Bedoya, especially after seeing how many big shots he's eaten at 170 pounds, especially from a power puncher like Chaos Williams. But I think we'll see Herbert, put together a good body of work and really chip away at Bedoya, winning this fight on the scorecards. And again, getting that plus money on the decision prop is probably the best way to go about it. Next up, undefeated prospect Victoria Dudakova comes in at minus 175 as she takes on the veteran Sam Hughes, who comes in at plus 150. Now, start off on the Dudakova side of things, who was expected to face Melissa Gatto back in March, but unfortunately a fight day illness pulled her out of that matchup, and it ultimately caused her to wait a little bit longer to get back in the cage. But the last time we saw her in the cage, she was able to go out there and win a 29-28 decision over veteran Jin Yu Fry. That was a matchup where we saw Dudakova utilize a striking heavy approach. After getting out grappled in the second round, we saw her utilize her volume and her jab down the pipe to keep Fry at bay and just pretty much cruise to a decision victory at that point. Normally, we see Dudakova utilize a grapple-heavy approach, taking opponents to the ground and grinding them out from that top position or looking for finishes from there. She's still very young, she's still very green, she's still very raw, but it was good to see some of the things that she showcased in the Fry fight, especially with Fry being such a veteran as she is. But the issue with Fry is that we've seen her fight at lower weight classes before, if I'm not mistaken, and I believe that we saw Dudakova take advantage of the range advantage that she had in that matchup and the striking disadvantage that Fry was at in that matchup as well. But Dudakova, she is promising, but I think that there are some holes in her game that can be exploited, and maybe Sam Hughes is somebody that can take advantage of that. Now, Hughes is a fighter that I've been a little bit overconfident in the past, specifically in her last fight against Yasmin Yadagui, where I really expected the pressure of Hughes and takedown of Hughes to reign supreme that night, but I really overlooked the physicality disadvantage Hughes had in that matchup, not to mention the power and the speed that Yadagui brought to the table. We saw Yadagui pretty much shut down the entire takedown game of Hughes by utilizing a lot of movement, a lot of range, striking her fast 1-2s down the pipe. It was damaging. It was nasty, and Hughes didn't seem like she had a prayer in that matchup, and I got a little bit overzealous considering what we've seen Hughes do in the past as a big underdog. Hughes is a fighter that likes to use pressure, likes to use takedowns, likes to weaponize her cardio, put a pace on her opponents, and try to drown them in deep waters, just like we saw her do against Jacqueline Amram in the last win that she has on her record. It's the physicality disadvantage that she's been at in certain fights that has caused her to actually end up coming out on the short end of the stick. Just by watching her IG, you can see that she's trying to improve that. She's trying to improve the explosivity, the power, the strength. She's trying to, tie up those ends because she has the ability to be a legitimate fighter. She has the ability to push a pace, to eat some shots and throw back in her own right, mix in takedowns, showcase good fight IQ. She has a great training camp over there at Fortis MMA. It seems like former UFC fighter Charles Byrd, I believe UFC, I think he was a Contender Series veteran, but Charles Byrd has taken her under a wing and try to make her a better fighter as well. At 32 years old, I don't think we'll see Hughes completely close that gap in terms of her skill level and the physicality, but I think she can still be a tough out for a lot of opponents, especially a youngster like Dudakova. Now, I get why this line is as close as it is, but I feel like we're going to see Dudakova love eventually come in throughout fight week, which could push Hughes up to that plus 180, maybe even plus 200 range. A lot of people are low on Hughes and continue to overlook the fact that she has that dog in her, that she can go out there and put on a decent pace and utilize a grind in the clinch, in the takedowns, and it could pay off for her here against the youngster Dudakova. I'll be keeping an eye on this line. I think Hughes can pull off the upset here. I think she can implement that grind that I thought she could do against Yadagui here against Dudakova, who does not have the explosivity, does not have a crazy good striking game, does not have that crazy speed and power down the pipe. And I think those shortcomings will allow Hughes to take advantage of that, closing the distance, gaining that grind on, putting on a pace, and potentially pulling away with this fight late. So give me Hughes by decision, but I'll wait and see where this line goes because I could definitely see a lot of love coming in for Dudakova come fight day or even weigh-in day. All right, next up, Guram Kutateladze finally makes another trip to the octagon, coming in as a minus 200 favorite. He was originally scheduled to fight Abdel Karim Al-Sawadi. Unfortunately, Al-Sawadi pulls out, and in comes former Cage Warriors featherweight champion Jordan Vucenic. who comes in at plus 170. Now, I'll start off on the Kutateladze side, who has had some trouble trying to make it to the cage ever since getting signed to the UFC in mid-2020. This is only going to be his fourth fight inside the UFC, and this is a guy who people had a lot of high hopes for. Not to mention, he had his UFC debut against Mateusz Gamrot, and that was a fight where he handed Mateusz Gamrot his first professional loss in 18 professional fights. That was a close, controversial-ish decision, but Kutateladze apparently did enough on two judges' scorecards for them to see the fight in his favor. Unfortunately, it's been downhill there from Kutateladze as he lost a split decision to Damir Ismagulov and then eventually got finished by Elvis Brener last year. In that Brener fight, he had a solid first 2 rounds. Actually, the first 3 minutes of that matchup was Brener landing some takedowns and having some good success with his pressure. But as Gurm continuously got back to his feet and utilized his striking advantage, we saw Kutateladze really start to batter him and swing that round back in his favor. In the second round, we saw him land a nasty elbow that cut up Elvis Brener and made that fight look like a complete bloodbath. It was clear that he had a striking advantage there, but it was also clear that the pressure, durability, and willingness for Brener to accept the war that Kutateladze was trying to present was starting to wear on Gurm. We saw in the third round, Gurm was really starting to slow down, and Brener stayed in his face and started to sense that Gurm was slowing down, hitting the gas and eventually getting Kutateladze out of there halfway through that third round. Very impressive performance from Brener there, who actually fights later on this card as well. But brings into question what the cardio of Kutateladze is like, especially when he's fighting guys that he's unable to put away. We've seen Kutateladze go 15 minutes and look stellar doing so, but I think it was more so the fact that Brener continued to push the pace even while getting outworked on the feet the way that he was. Kutateladze, all-star from Sweden. He trains out of the All-Stars gym there alongside guys like Hamzat Chimaev. He's a Georgian by trade, so he has that Murab connection as well. They're not really training partners, but I know they've definitely shared the mats a few times. He likes to lean on his striking. He loves throwing the elbow. He's nasty with that up elbow down the middle. His defensive grappling, not that bad either. When guys try to take him to the ground, he's immediately working back to his feet, but he loves to lean on that striking. We know he has the wrestling if he needs it, but it's weird that we haven't really seen him try to implement it heavily enough to try to grind his opponents out. But he might try to do that this weekend against a smaller Jordan Vucenic, who makes his UFC debut on short notice and up a weight class. Vucenic just fought a week and a half to 2 weeks ago where he picked up a first round submission victory over Adrian Kepa, I believe the kid's name was, or the man's name was. I think it was an aging veteran, if I'm not mistaken. But Vucenic is a former Cage Warriors featherweight champion, in which he won off of current UFC fighter Morgan Sherrier. He ended up defending it once against James Hendon, and then he ended up losing it in a rematch to Paul Hughes, the only guy to give Paul Hughes a professional loss, although it was a controversial decision. Hughes came back in the rematch and made it known that he probably should have ended up winning that fight and made it a lot more convincing than the first fight. Since then, Vucenic has gone out there and beat on regional journeymen pretty much. He's finished all 4 of them. Finishing is not usually in Vucenic's nature, as you saw in his rise to the Cage Warriors promotion. But he was able to, have solid stylistic matchups and go out there and finish some of these guys to make it look good enough for the UFC to eventually sign him. He deserves to be at this level. Now comes a question of how high and how far he can take it in the UFC. Usually he utilizes a Muay Thai striking approach, nasty kicks, nasty combinations, and recently has been looking to take fights to the ground where he knows he can eventually find submission against his opponents. Guys who have had success against him in the past have utilized grapple-heavy approaches to keep him away from his striking advantage, put him on his back, and usually grind him out from that top position. And that's where we saw in the Paul Hughes fight. It seemed like he was completely broken and demoralized 3 rounds into that matchup after Hughes was utilizing that type of approach. But Vucenic, again, we have to consider that he has been making improvements in that grappling realm, hence why we've probably been seeing him look to grapple in his recent fights as well. But in this matchup against Gurm, I would not be surprised to see Gurm look to take this fight to the ground. He knows he's going to be the bigger guy. We know he's going to be the stronger guy, and that could end up being the difference maker in this matchup. Just as we saw a couple weeks ago with Fatima Klein, who came in as an undefeated, highly touted prospect, she got outgrinded by Jasmine Jasudavicius, who, whether Jasudavicius had the size advantage or not, she may have still been successful in that approach given her own skill level, but it was clearly impacting Klein's ability to have success of her own. That could end up being the case here. Both guys are solid strikers, so it could eventually be a wash in that realm. But the size advantage and the ability for Grum to grind on Vucenic could end up being the difference maker here. So I would be like lock of the night confident on Kutateladze. Has had his cardio issue not be as glaring as it was in his last matchup against Brener. I'd like to see a little bit more fights of him showcase that he doesn't really have a cardio advantage, but I feel like he can really control and dictate where this fight takes place, which will allow him to dictate the pace as well, which is where his cardio issues may not come into play. I look for him to go out there and grind out Vucenic, mixing in his striking, mixing in his grappling, keeping Vucenic on the defensive, but that will not predict or predicate how far and how good Vucenic can be at, especially when he goes back to fighting at 145 pounds. But I'm going to go Kutateladze here, Kutateladze by decision, and I think he wins grinding this fight out pretty much. Our next up heavyweights going out of here as we have the returning Shamil Gaziev coming in at minus 220 going up against Don'Tale Mayes, who comes in at plus 185. Last time around for Shamil Gaziev, we saw him have his first UFC main event as he came up short against Jairzinho Rozenstruik. The name was escaping me for a second there. But great performance there from Rozenstruik. Solid start to the fight for Gaziev, but it seemed like his cardio was really starting to fade, especially with his inability to get the fight to the ground. And Rozenstruik's tremendous striking advantage in that matchup kept Gaziev on the back end of the 1-2s, kept him at bay, kept him at distance, and that ultimately caused Gaziev to slow down. He was broken, he was demoralized. I believe he broke his nose as well, which really didn't help his cardio issue either. But yeah, this is a big bounce back, prove me spot for Gaziev, who normally goes out there and gets his opponents out of there quickly. This is a guy that does not mess around at all. He looks to take his opponents to the ground and smash them from that top position, getting them out of there relatively quickly. Against Martin Bedoya, we didn't really see him go for takedowns. We more so saw him just walk Bedoya down, land his big strikes, and eventually finish him in the second round. And I think that fight kind of proves that he doesn't really have this huge cardio issue that people will likely be lamenting on this weekend because of that Rozenstruik performance. I just think that Rozenstruik was the better striker that night, and he did a good enough job in terms of keeping that fight upright that it caused Gaziev to slow down and just, break, be demoralized, and that could cause him to stress out. That could cause him to start slowing down. But in fights where he is the one able to dictate the pace and keep his opponents on the back foot, that's where we'll see him really start to be effective even in deeper waters. His opponent this weekend, Don'Tale Mayes, is coming off of a decision victory over Kyle Machado. A very close fight, could have gone either way. I kind of lean Machado that night, but I could see how you end up giving that fight to Mayes as well. Mayes is an all-around heavyweight. He can grapple, he can strike, but he doesn't do anything tremendously well, which will always keep him outside of the top 10 in the heavyweight division. Since joining the UFC, is 4-4. Technically 4-5 had it not been for that failed USADA test by Hamdi Abdel Wahab about 2 years ago at this point in time. But that's as mediocre and as average proof as you'll get that Mayes is just a middling heavyweight in the UFC. It doesn't really have a whole lot of power. Andrei Arlovski may say otherwise, but a guy that can just strike, he can grapple, he can be outstruck, he can be outgrappled. That's why you see guys that are much better strikers or much better grapplers able to make him look kind of bad. And that's, I think, going to be the case here against Gaziev. I think we're going to see Gaziev first and foremost come out with a vengeance. I think we're going to see him come out there and try to prove a point to the UFC masses who were big fans of him going into the main event against Rozenstruik, but then came out on the other hand and said, this guy sucks, this guy was a fraud, and this guy was just not as good as people were expecting him to be. But I think this is the perfect matchup for Gaziev to bounce back. I don't think Mayes prevents too many issues here. I think Gaziev can drag this fight to the ground without much issue. But even if Gaziev wants to take the Martin Bedoya approach and look to walk down Don'Tale Mayes with the striking and the power that he brings to the table, I think that could ultimately even lead to a finish for Gaziev here within the first 2 rounds. So I might, have to eat my words here, but I feel like Gaziev is a pretty damn good spot, and I think we're getting a good enough discount on him here because of the performance in his last fight. But Don'Tale Mayes is no Jairzinho Rozenstruik. And again, Jairzinho Rozenstruik, people have kind of scoffed at his talent level in the past, but you have to give him his credit in terms of his striking that he brings to the table. And he showcased against Gaziev. I don't think Mayes can do that. I think Gaziev cruises here and eventually gets a finish within the first 6 or 7 minutes. Our next up, Muhammad Yahya coming in at plus 340, going up against Fernandes, who comes in at minus 410. Starting off on the Yahya side, he dropped his UFC debut back in October to Trevor Peek in a matchup where he pretty much got beat everywhere. Yahya is a guy on the regional scene who came in as the UAE Warriors, I believe, lightweight champion, who showcased pretty much all aspects of the game. He could strike, he could grapple, but similar to Dontel Mays, similar to there's another fighter that I just talked about. Maybe not. I think I was thinking about Dontel Mays. Doesn't show extraordinary talent in any one aspect of mixed martial arts. I think the best trait that he has is his ability to grind opponents out. His inability to do it against Trevor Peek, I think, was more so an attribution to Peek's improvements. Peek is no longer this guy that just looks to point to the ground and throw down and try to knock his opponents out and lean on his insane durability. He's clearly improving the rest of his game as well. But I think mix the power with the grappling from Peek, I kind of see how he ends up beating Muhammad Yahya. But I think we'll see a better version of Yahya this weekend. I think he will have taken that loss pretty badly and showcased that he wants to be a better fighter. Again, he's not anything special, but he can compete with maybe the lower half of the UFC's roster at this weight class. He's going up against Fernandes, who had an unfortunate UFC debut loss to Mark Diakese back in November. Diakese pretty much grinded him out. I have no idea how one judge actually scored that fight for Fernandes. He had some decent strikes on the feet, but for the most part, Diakese was able to drag that fight to the ground and take advantage of the one big flaw in Fernandes' game that I've seen in the past. He's a little bit too reliant on his jiu-jitsu. He can throw up submissions, he can throw up reversals and get-ups and all that stuff, but he finds himself on his back way too much, and that often allows his opponents to grind him out. The loss that he had before coming to the UFC was against a fighter who he had solid success against in the first round, but then we saw him unable to finish his opponent, causing him to gas out and then eventually just stay on his back for the next 2 rounds. Yahya is more than capable of doing that here. Now, obviously, I have a little bit of reservations in terms of Yahya's ability to stay out of the submissions that Fernandes will be throwing off of his back. But if he's able to get around past that first round, he could have success in terms of keeping Fernandes on his back and doing what other opponents have had success with, and that's keeping Fernandes there, staying out of the submissions, landing good enough shots from that top position to keep this fight on the ground. And I think we'll see that approach here from Yahya. He's going to look to grind him out. And I just don't understand the minus 410 here. Sure, that on paper, Fernandes looks like a phenomenal fighter, but when you watch his fights, he leaves too many openings for his opponents to take advantage of him. And I think that Yahya, as mediocre as he is live as a plus 340 underdog to put Fernandes in those bad positions and look for a grinding, cruising decision of his own. So, Fernandes, sure, more dangerous in terms of finding finishes, but Yahya, if his durability holds up here, he should be able to get his grind going and keeping Fernandes in uncomfortable positions and winning this fight on the scorecards. All right, next fight, we got Azamat Murzakanov coming in at minus 220, going up against Alonzo Menifield, who comes in at plus 185. We'll start off on the Murzakanov side, who is still undefeated, 3-0 in the UFC now, most recently going out there and getting that victory over it was a victory over Dustin Jacoby in a fight where it seemed like Jacoby was pretty much winning the majority of that fight, but was ended up getting hit with some big shots from Murzakanov, which changed the tide of the fight and eventually had his scorecards go in his favor. He's a light heavyweight that loves to kind of bounce on his toes and just blitz in and out with big strikes. He has some decent speed. He has good power, although he hasn't produced a finish outside of the Tafon and Chukwi finish. He is a guy that we need to respect his power. We need to respect his ability to close the distance as quickly as he does at 205 pounds and land with the power that he does. He is a Russian, and you would expect him to have a little bit of a wrestling skill set and background, but he doesn't often use it to try to grind his opponents out. It's more so defensively that he tries to use it. If he finds himself hurt, he'll shoot a takedown. If he finds himself backed up against the cage, he'll feint a takedown or change levels or even actually go for the takedown to try to get out of those bad positions. But often we see him very mobile, moving a lot from outside and trying to utilize that big power whenever he crashes the pocket to try to knock his opponents out. knock them down, or just land significant enough damage that if fights end up going to his scorecards, he can still end up getting his hand raised. Now, Alonzo Menifield fights similarly to Murzakanov in the fact that not a lot of output, not a lot of optically good things that he does for the judges, but it's his power. The Dustin Jacoby fight, I thought he was losing 90% of that fight, but the 10% he made the most of, which was knocking down Jacoby numerous times, hurting him visibly, especially for the judges, and then going on to win that fight on the scorecards. That's what Menifield does. He either knocks opponents out, knocks them down, tries to mix it up in the clinch and utilizes strength in that type of fashion, and then eventually start opening up with big shots and trying to get his opponents out of there. Otherwise, he doesn't really have a whole lot else to offer. Not a crazy good takedown game. I believe his lone submission victory came against that. I don't even remember his name, but the guy that came in with the fake record who got immediately cut from the UFC. Menifield, power. That's all you need to worry about. Menifield often finds himself as the underdog, just as he does here in this matchup against Murzakanov, and it's all because of the power that he could potentially land. And that's the same thing with Murzakanov. I think Murzakanov is a little bit better of a minute winner in terms of being able to land more damage, land more output, but Menifield could change this fight on a dime just with that power if he's able to land it as a counter, or even by trying to blitz the pocket as well and land his own damage. I have no clue who's going to win this fight with much confidence at all. I'm going to go on the Murzakanov side just because, like I said, he has a little bit more paths to victory here. But Menifield, just as we've seen time and time again, that fight-changing power will always be looming over all of his matchups. So I could never have a lock of the night pick against him at this stage in his career just because of what he's been able to do in recent fights. But I'm going to go Murzakanov, maybe even Murzakanov by knockout in this spot. Maybe fight ends by knockout could be a better way to go about it too. But I do think that Murzakanov ends up winning this fight and knocking out Menifield. Very low confidence though. All right, next up, Joel Alvarez coming in at -160, going up against Elvis Brener, who comes in at +140. There should be a banger of a fight between both guys that love to push pressure, love to push with aggressiveness, and try to get their opponents out of there. Joel Alvarez, his only two losses came at the hands of Arman Tsarukyan and Damir Ismagulov, who were able to shut down that aggressive style that he brings to the table and pretty much grind him out. Ismagulov beat him by decision. Tsarukyan landed a nasty cut on him that ended up stopping the fight. But he is a big lightweight. This guy's 6'3" with a 77-inch reach. Loves to just utilize that power and that size just to try to knock his opponents out. He's very aggressive with his jiu-jitsu, so even if he's on his back, he's always looking to throw up submissions or looking to choke his opponents out. On the feet, he's looking to utilize his elbows, forward movement, his kicks. He's very nasty in those situations as well. And then we saw him pick up, I guess, the biggest win of his UFC career last time around against Mark Diakese. It came by a headbutt, which eventually led to a submission, but still, credit to Alvarez for capitalizing on that moment and actually getting the victory there. Elvis Brener started his UFC career off pretty well, but last time around, we saw him get grinded out by Miktaibek Orolbai and continue to showcase his grit and durability that makes him so dangerous against most opponents. He was on the cusp of getting finished numerous times by Orolbai, but for some reason, Orolbai continued to look for takedowns rather than getting Elvis Brener out of there. Brener brings a lot of pressure with his strikes. He's a BJJ black belt training under the Diego Lima camp alongside Charles Oliveira, so you often see those guys in his corner. He's very aggressive. He's ruthless. He's a savage, which is why this is probably going to be fight of the night when it's all said and done. I still end up leaning on the Alvarez side. I think Brener might be the technically better fighter here, but I think the size, the pressure, the power that Alvarez brings to the table here will continuously put Brener in bad positions, and that will open up finishing opportunities for Alvarez. Whether it's a club and sub, whether it's just straight up club and drumming. Even if Brener looks to take this to the ground and try to grind out Alvarez from that top position, I think he's going to struggle to keep Alvarez in those spots, especially with how big and how active Alvarez is off of his back. I really think size plays a huge factor into Alvarez's fights. Just seeing what he did to Thiago Moises and walking through him goes to show like that physicality and that size is very intimidating for a lot of fighters having to deal with that coming their way. And seeing that here for Alvarez, I think he'll be able to do that even with Brener showcasing tremendous durability as we've seen in the past. I think he's going to struggle to deal with the aggressiveness of Alvarez here, and that will likely lead to Alvarez finishing inside the distance. It's tough to call KO or sub here, considering Alvarez is capable of doing both things, but I think Alvarez, I think he does a damn good job here and finishes Brener. All right, next up, we got Mackenzie Dern coming in at -130, going up against Lupita Godinez, who comes in at +110. Now, last time around, Dern ended up coming up short against Amanda Lemos in a matchup where she had plenty of time to try to get her submission game going by getting the back of Lemos, but credit to Amanda showcasing superior submission defense, and she was able to stay out of those submissions and eventually land more damage than Dern and end up winning that fight on the scorecards. Dern, we know she's always going to be a liability in the striking realm. She, where we've seen her have most success against other strikers is just by biting down on her mouthpiece, crashing the pocket with big strikes, and eventually initiating the grappling sequences with her takedowns or trips or even pulling guard, so much so that she can eventually find the reversal or find a submission off of her back. But we know that where she's capped at. She's not going to be a championship level fighter, but she will always be fighting hard for your money based on her style and willingness to just eat some damage in return. Her durability is insane. Like, I know Jessica Andrade finished her a few fights ago, but seeing the shots that she took from Amanda Lemos and still managing to stay in that fight, absolutely crazy. She always finds a way to finagle her way to finding grappling scenarios, but, it comes down to whether she can find submissions or not to outdo the damage that she's eating in the striking realm. Now, our opponent this weekend, Lupita Godinez, ended up getting grinded out by Vera Jandiroba last time, as I really expected Godinez and her wrestling background to allow her to stay away from the grappling attempts of Jandiroba, but Jandiroba is so good in terms of creating grappling opportunities of her own, initiating the clinch, jumping on the back of her opponents, pulling guard, pulling off reversals. She's so good in terms of getting that going, just as we saw the other week when she took on Amanda Lemos herself. Godinez, maybe not as good as people thought she was when she initially came into the UFC. I think her, loss to Jessica Pena kind of highlighted that as well. But she's improving the rest of her game. She's a solid striker, throws in combinations, good boxing. Wrestling will always be there for her if she needs it. But it's her ability to try to establish her range and beat up her opponents on the feet, especially when she's going up against fellow grapplers, especially against fighters that are really good with their jiu-jitsu. We saw her come up short against Vera Jandiroba, but I think she could potentially have some success here against Dern by just sticking and moving, learning from that Jandiroba fight. Do not let these grapplers get anywhere close to you, because you can find yourself in compromising positions where even though you're not getting finished, you might get grinded out. So that's why I understand why Dern is a slight favorite in this matchup, because Godinez has been fluky or flaky, I should say. Just as we saw in the last matchup. I still lean Godinez here. I don't think I'll end up getting to the betting window, though, because I feel like she just burned me a little bit too much in the past, but this seems like a very winnable fight for her. She's clearly the better wrestler, especially with Dern having as low success rate with her takedowns as she does. You got to believe that Godinez is going to be able to keep this fight in the upright position. Just treat the clinch like hot lava. Stay out of the clinch. Strike, get out. Strike, get out. Let's see if she can do that here. And if she is, I think she could look pretty damn good as the underdog here at +110, but I don't want to touch this fight. All right, next up, Tony Ferguson. Yes, Tony Ferguson, El Kukui, stepping back into the cage, trying to buck the 7-fight losing streak he is currently on. He comes in as a +435 underdog. He goes up against Michael Chiesa, who comes in at -610. I'll start off on the Tony Ferguson side, who had a 12-fight winning streak that earned, as well as, there was a 12-fight winning streak that led him to a second interim title fight against Justin Gaethje in 2020, and since then he has never looked the same. Gaethje was able to shut him down, utilize his superior striking approach, batter him over 4.5 rounds until the referee mercilessly stopped that matchup in Tony Ferguson's favor. And then since then, Ferguson has been unable to win a fight. What made him so dangerous during that 12-fight winning streak was his ability to create chaos and thrive within it. There were some close fights that he probably could have ended up losing had he not been a little bit more savage than his opponent. But as we're seeing him fight some top flight competition and the blueprint being out there in terms of how to defeat a guy like Ferguson, it's not been that great for him. I think the best we've seen him look during this losing streak was that first round he had against Michael Chandler until he got his head kicked into orbit by Michael Chandler with that beautiful front kick up the middle. Yeah, it's just so sad to see Ferguson at 40 years old still going out there and trying to find that win that could buck this losing streak that he's currently on. We know he has a nasty choke game. We know his jiu-jitsu and all that, but he may just believe too much in it, which is why opponents have been able to grind him out, taking him to the ground over and over again and having success from that top position. His opponent this weekend will be looking just to do that. Michael Chiesa is on was on a 4-fight winning streak and in a pretty good spot in 2021, but after that he had a loss to Vicente Luque, which now finds himself on a 3-fight losing streak. When Chiesa is at his best, he's using takedowns, looking to grind opponents out from that top position or looking to find submissions and get them out of there that way as well. One of the dubious honors that he has is the one guy, I think he has more than half of the Darce choke losses in the UFC. Obviously, most recently getting that Darce choke loss to Kevin Holland. We saw Vicente Luque choke him out that way. Guys just have, I don't know what it is with Chiesa, but he just often finds himself in that position with his head available for guys to just take it on home with them. His striking, not all that good in my opinion. It's all to eventually get that takedown so that he can either find a submission on the mat or just establish positions where he can grind opponents out. Now in this matchup with Ferguson, there's no way I'm going to trust Chiesa at minus 610. When you have Chiesa, a guy who has lost by Darce choke 3 times throughout his UFC career, and then going up against Tony Ferguson, who has 3 Darce choke wins of his own on his career, you got to take a little bit of a sprinkle at Ferguson by submission, which looking at it now is plus 800. That's a great spot to take a little bit of a sprinkle, considering the flaw in Chiesa's game and his ability to just find himself in Darce chokes. It's weird. The striking, maybe even Ferguson has a little bit of an advantage there. Chiesa is decent, but is he good enough to go out there and just keep Ferguson on his back? Without finding himself in some trouble, I don't think so. I'm not 100% sure about that. Chiesa hasn't even looked that good as of late either. Chiesa is a guy that's more so in tune with trying to be a UFC analyst and try to break down fights rather than actually competing nowadays. So the prediction is still going to be Chiesa just because it's hard to trust somebody on a 7-fight losing streak and who's 40 years old. But considering the holds that Chiesa leaves as well, I would not at all be surprised if Ferguson ends up going out there and getting a submission victory here. So I'm going to go Chiesa by decision, but I'll likely have a little bit of action on Ferguson by submission. All right, next up, probably one of my favorite fights on the entire card. Marlon Chito Vera coming in at plus 145, going up against former flyweight champion Davison Figueiredo, who has been perfect since joining the bantamweight division, defeating Rob Font, and then most recently Cody Garbrandt back at UFC 300. But let's start off on the Marlon Vera side, who was coming off a absolute beatdown at the hands of champion Sugar Sean O'Malley, who was able to go out there and just absolutely destroy him over 25 minutes. There's no need that Vera should have fought that fight. There were so many more viable contenders for O'Malley, but there was that built-in storyline with the lone loss that O'Malley has in the UFC at the hands of Marlon Vera. A lot of people are thinking because of the injury, but I think O'Malley shut that all up by dispatching and dismantling Marlon Vera in the way that he does. Vera is starting to show that he is, maybe starting to fade in his own way. He has that victory over Pedro Munoz before that O'Malley fight, and that was a fight that I thought Munoz did enough to actually win as well. Vera's a guy that's a slow starter that likes to try to get his aggressive striking going in the second and third rounds, utilizing a nasty array of kicks, elbows, and knees to hurt his opponents. But again, is a guy that can be grinded out, is a guy that can be outstruck, just as we saw by Jose Aldo, just as we saw by Corey Sandhagen, just as we saw by Sean O'Malley in his last matchup. I think just his entertaining nature has made him such a popular fighter. But if you look at the fighters that he's beating as of late, question marks, controversial decisions, aging veterans, guys with suspect durability. That's a real concern in Marlon Vera's resume. Now, talking about Davison Figueiredo, like I said, 2-0 since transitioning to 135 pounds. He'll be 37 in December, but it's clear that it was hell for him to try to make 125 pounds, which is why he's decided to fight at 135. This is the perfect weight class for him at this stage of his career, so he doesn't have to deplete himself or worry about potentially slowing down later on in matchups, just as we've seen in the past. This is a guy that used to lean on that power punching style to try to knock opponents out or club and sub them, which eventually led him to winning that flyweight title. But what we've been seeing as of late is him leaning on his grappling, looking to utilize his jiu-jitsu, get opponents to the ground, grind them out, find submissions like he did against Cody Garbrandt. But he's mixing that power punching style with the striking so well. That power punching style with his grappling so well that he's still very effective at this, at the latter half of his career that he's at right now. In this matchup against Vera, I will not at all be surprised to see Figueiredo try to do exactly what he did against Cody Garbrandt. Land some big shots, look to take this to the ground, and keep Vera on the defensive. And we've seen Vera kind of just concede that position in the past where he might throw up some submissions, but if you're able to stay out of them, you're able to keep him on his back and keep him defending. And I can completely understand why Davidson's roughly around that 60 to 65% implied odds, because he is more than capable of doing that here against Vera. So I do like Figgy. I think Figgy's cardio issues are kind of a thing of the past, especially in fights where he's able to dictate the pace. And I feel like this is a matchup where he can absolutely implement his grapple-heavy approach and keep Vera on his back, or at least up against the cage for the majority of this fight, and win it on the scorecards. All right, next up, Shara Magomedov coming in at minus 220, going up against Michal Oleksiejczuk coming in at plus 185. This is a fight that will surely produce fireworks and is more than worthy of being a co-main event over the aging, sloppy veteran matchup that was originally scheduled for this co-main event slot between Nick Diaz and Vicente Luque. Now, Magomedov, I believe, is only 6 weeks removed since his last matchup where he ended up defeating... he had his UFC debut over Bruno Silva, and then lastly defeating Antonio Tricoli 6 weeks ago at UFC Saudi Arabia. But now people are kind of just saying, hey, this guy is a fade. This guy is not what we expect him to be. And I was thinking that after the first fight against Bruno Silva. I'm not sure why everybody was thinking it after the Tricoli fight. Even though he still ended up finishing Tricoli, you see the issues that are in his game. He needs that space. He needs that distance to implement the kicking heavy game that he likes to operate at. He's a Muay Thai specialist, so obviously he has knees and elbows that he can get off on. But if he has a fighter that is clearly looking to take him to the ground, he doesn't really provide much off of his back. He tries to stay active with his elbows and his punches off of his back, which caused Bruno Silva a lot of issues. But Bruno Silva is not a grappler. Bruno Silva looked to the grappling because he was getting overwhelmed in the striking realm because he could not close the distance well enough. But a better grappler will definitely keep Magomedov in bad positions and take full advantage of that. But Magomedov is a guy that needs to dictate the pace to have success. That's where he's able to just establish his kicking game and keep opponents at bay. But I do not at all think he is as good as people are making him out to be or what his record indicates. He's going up against a fight that he should technically win, but given Michal Oleksiejczuk's style of just staying in his opponent's face, keeping that forward movement and keeping them uncomfortable, he is more than capable of pulling off the upset in this matchup. Last time around, we saw him go up against Kevin Holland. I believe that fight was in February or March, and he dropped Kevin Holland with a big shot, but then made a huge mistake of following Kevin Holland to the ground, which is where Holland was able to pull off that armbar, where it looked like he may have broke Oleksiejczuk's arm, but apparently he didn't. It was more superficial more than anything, which is why Oleksiejczuk is able to take this short notice opportunity to try to pull off a big upset here against Magomedov. I love Oleksiejczuk's style. Forward movement, body work, pressure, try to knock his opponents out, and that usually allows him to go out there and break his opponents. This is a perfect style to try to trump Magomedov's striking style. Sure, Magomedov could potentially knock him out. Magomedov could maybe hurt him to the body, get him out of there that way. But if Oleksiejczuk stays on the pressure, stays on the gas, just as we normally see him, he could provide a similar result to the Kevin Holland result in terms of what happened in the stand-up realm by landing big shots on the feet. And we know kickers, their worst enemy are guys that keep that forward pressure, that stay in their face and don't allow them the range or distance required to be effective with their kicks. And I think that we'll see that here with Oleksiejczuk. So I don't think that this will be a popular pick this week, but I do lean the Oleksiejczuk side. I just think that his pressure is always something that you can lean on as an underdog as well. You want dogs to back as an underdog, and this guy is absolutely a dog here in Oleksiejczuk. Look for Oleksiejczuk to walk down Magomedov, maybe knock him out. You know what I mean? I think that we'll see enough exchanges in the pocket here, and I favor Oleksiejczuk ever so slightly because I just think he's, with his hands, I think he's a superior striker. Overall striker, maybe Magomedov is the better overall striker, but given the way Oleksiejczuk fights, he's going to make it very hard for Magomedov to get comfortable, and that will allow Oleksiejczuk to knock him out. All right, main event time here. Very, very fun fight, high level fight, possibly some championship stakes on the line as well. We got Corey Sandhagen coming in at plus 245, going up against Umar Nurmagomedov, who comes in at minus 285. Now we'll start off on the Sandhagen side, who obviously we know what he brings to the table. Unorthodox striking approach, a lot of good cardio, a lot of good submissions. Last time around we saw him, actually, quick fact here, coming into this fight, it will be his 8th straight main event or co-main event slot. So it's clear that the UFC is leaning on this guy in the bantamweight division given his fighting style. But last time around didn't really present the result that the UFC was hoping in terms of entertainment value, as he actually injured himself in the fight against Rob Font and ended up having to wrestle the rest of the time, keeping Rob Font on his back and just grinding that out. He immediately apologized in the post-fight interview due to that style that he had to implement. But at the end of the day, he needed to get his hand raised, and it seems like the UFC was forgiving him, hence his main event slot once again here against Nurmagomedov. So as we saw in the last fight for Sandhagen, he can wrestle if he needs to, but I think it more so came down to the type of matchup that he had. Will he be able to out-wrestle Nurmagomedov? Probably not, but he might be able to provide a little bit of resistance and issues in that spot. Where I think Sandhagen is best is when he can set up his traps with the striking, his unorthodox stance, his strikes, his cardio as well, which he weaponizes very well, setting a high pace, causing opponents to slow down so he can take over in deep water. And then his slick jiu-jitsu that he likes to implement against guys that shoot desperation takedowns or are a little bit too lazy with their defense when they're trying to control that top position. Sandhagen will forever be one of the best bantamweights of all time. Not the best, but one of. You got to talk about top 10 bantamweights of all time. You can't not mention Corey Sandhagen, especially with his BMF type of style as well, right? You're talking about a guy that fights anybody, any time. Like he's fought pretty much all the bantamweights you can think of, with maybe the exception of Dominic Cruz. And in Barao, obviously Barao was before his time. But you're talking about Aljamain Sterling, TJ Dillashaw, all these names that he's been fighting. Rob Font, like he fights the best of the best whenever it's sent to him. Petr Yan. Now Nurmagomedov. This is a guy that apparently a lot of people have been avoiding and ducking. But luckily, you have a guy in Corey Sandhagen who is more than willing to take on this test because he believes that if you are the best in the world, you can beat anybody. And Nurmagomedov is his next test. Nurmagomedov is a guy that utilizes his striking more than his grappling, and both are just as good as the other. He's 17-0. Last time around, we saw him defeat Almacan with a grapple-heavy approach, but just doing nasty damage from the top position as well when he was able to get those takedowns. But this is a guy spinning stuff, flying stuff. He likes it all. He's very entertaining as a striker, but if he really needs that dub and he really needs to separate himself from his opponents, that's where we see him just so good with his takedowns and ability to control opponents, stay a step ahead of them in terms of the scrambling. His cardio looks on point as well. This guy could end up surpassing Khabib, could surpass Islam Makhachev in terms of how dominant and how successful he could be in the UFC. Let's just see him stay a little bit more active, though, because that would obviously help him in terms of that legacy. But Nurmagomedov, very, very good in my opinion. This will be his toughest test to date, so I can understand why he's not minus 600 in this spot. But I still believe that he's more than capable of going out there and implementing his game without having much issue in return. Sandhagen could provide some issues in terms of the striking with his unorthodox style, maybe some submissions off of his back, but I think Nurmagomedov is too clean and too disciplined to get caught by any of that stuff, and that will allow him to go out there and put together a better body of work and win this fight on the scorecards. So give me Nurmagomedov, and Nurmagomedov by decision. All right, there you guys go. Full card breakdown for UFC Abu Dhabi. Tomorrow I'll be back for the top 3 lock of the night candidates. Wednesday, top 3 dog of the night candidates. One of those 2 days I'll also be dropping the PFL breakdowns, so stay tuned for that. Thursday, quick picks. Friday, Locky 2-step free parlay, 3 best prop bets. And then Saturday, immediate reaction. Thankfully, it's an afternoon card, so we can get it done nice and early. But very much looking forward to this card this weekend. Appreciate all the love. Appreciate all the support. I'll see you guys again tomorrow. Peace.
Last thing.